Hi everyone, today I review Queen of Wands by Cat Willett from 2022. It's a comic strip style biography of Pamela Colman Smith, the illustrator of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. As you can see, it's a very attractive looking book with a lovely bright jolly colour. And it's an extremely elegant, extremely able, extremely attractive production. So in a way, it's a no-brainer. One hoovers it up. The outside and the inner sleeve are very jaunty, bright yellow. The colours of the interior are actually a bit more sombre. They tend to be grey and greyish purple and beige and brown and so forth. Now, my reservations about this production are to do with the text. And clearly, it's just a comic book. You don't expect it to be a work of great academic research. In a sense, alarm bells rang when I got to quite early on in the book. Page 10, the writer and artist Cat Willett describes going to see a tarot reader when she first arrived in New York and she needed some guidance. And she has a reading. She talks about having a reading and she says this: "In general, I feel ambivalent about the occult, but I'm sure of the deep connection that my reader felt with the symbolism of the cards and of his efforts to pass that meaning on to me." So in other words, she doesn't commit herself to be someone who is into tarot cards, far less someone who believes that you can actually get messages or insights or meaning from tarot card readings. She's distanced from the very word go. And, you know, clearly I am a dedicated tarot reader, so that rang my alarm bells slightly. Then she says, "Years later, when I was looking for a research topic for graduate school, I vaguely recalled Pamela's name and looked her up online. At the time, my search yielded only one sparse Wikipedia page." And she comments, "Why hadn't I learned about this incredibly prolific artist in art school? And what could I do to surface her story?" And I think by using the word surface as a verb there, which I don't approve of, she means bring the cultural figure of Pamela Colman Smith out of the murky depths of oblivion, of being ignored, up to the surface of the fish pond so that we can all know about her and admire her and hear about her work. So then the book proceeds along the lines of, here's this incredibly prolific, talented artist who is not widely known about, who no one taught me about in art school, and so, hey, that must be because of sexism. Now, I'm in favour of feminist rewritings of history, and I'm in favour of queer rewritings of history. Nevertheless, it's possible to get it right and to get it less right. I feel that the tendency of this book is to treat Pamela Colman Smith like one might treat Hilda af Klint, this very important, very advanced artist from the same era as Pamela, whose works were ignored, and probably because of sexism. In other words, there was an all-male stranglehold on the art world, and Hilda af Klint was way ahead of her time. And ironically, she was also into spiritualism like Pamela. And, you know, no one would talk to her. Rudolf Steiner didn't give her a proper interview. And so she has languished in obscurity. And we have rediscovered her. We have now got exhibitions of her in the Tate Gallery London and New York and all over the place. And she is in the canon. Now, how can I put this? Pamela Colman Smith is the mother of modern tarot reading. She is, in that respect, someone who's changed the world. She is a huge cultural figure, as I keep saying on my channel. And really, she is up there in the history of tarot and psychism. And for that, she will always be in the pantheon, as far as the history of the esoteric and the spiritual is concerned. And that is why she is an important person. She's not an important person because she was a groundbreaking artist. Now, I wouldn't normally criticise a book line by line, but In this case, I find the inaccuracies of the text so kind of alarming that I have to say something about it. I mean, I think if this book has been published, I'm a reviewer and it's my right and my duty to talk about what I see here printed on the page. It's the chapter on the Rider-Waite tarot deck, and in particular the chapter on the history of tarot. Okay, so we have some background stuff. Playing cards come from the Arab world. They might have been produced in China. This is all fine. And then the author starts to talk about the early days of tarot. She talks about the Solabusca deck, which she rather vaguely calls the first known complete painted deck. Well, okay, it's the earliest deck that survives in its completion, but it is not the first known deck. The first known deck is the Visconti Sforza deck, which seems to have come a few years earlier than the Solabusca. Doesn't matter. She's talking about the days of the invention of tarot in Italy in the Renaissance. Fair enough. And she says this here. At this time, the figures included in the drawings of most decks were primarily male. Female figures such as queens, empresses or maidens that we see in modern decks were less common. Now, I think the author is actually talking about the early days of playing card decks. Now, playing card decks from the Arab world had court cards that were all male. They had a king and 2 viceroys or some variation on that theme. And when playing cards came into Europe a little bit before the birth of tarot, some of the decks, like in Northern Europe, had all male court cards. Some of them didn't. One of tarot's innovations was that it introduced queens into the courts. So the queens in the tarot decks were really there from the beginning. So figures such as queens, empresses, well, so that's untrue for a start. Figures such as empresses, well, you know, the major arcana of the tarot has changed over the years. It kind of settled down a bit. Personally, I haven't heard of a tarot deck that doesn't contain an empress. Now, what distinguishes tarot from playing cards is the 21 trump cards, these cards with pictures of archetypes on them. And from the word go, they would have had the female pope, the empress, they would have had the 3 virtues of strength, temperance, and justice. Temperance and justice are always female. Strength is sometimes male, sometimes female. But you know, the star is usually female, occasionally male. Okay, let's talk about existing decks that exist in museums, and you can see them on YouTube. You can see flip-throughs of reprinted versions of old decks. If you look at the oldest tarot in the world, the Visconti Sforza, I looked at it on YouTube the other day, and I counted up in the major arcana. There were 8 cards with a primary or sole figure that was female, and there were 8 cards with a primary or sole figure that was male. There were 6 cards that were kind of like groups of people, or a sexless figure like death, or an androgynous figure like the devil, but you know, it was about 50-50 male-female. On top of that, there were tarots in the early days of tarot, including the Visconti Sforza, that had female pages. And the Visconti Sforza deck had not only female pages, it also had female knights. So each suit had a king, a knight, and a page, and a queen, and a female knight, or a mounted lady, and a female page. So there were 12 female court card figures in the Visconti Sforza tarot. As we go down the bottom of this page, we come to a statement that kind of blows my mind here. She's talking about, you know, the fact that there weren't very many female figures in the tarot, and she says, this was in part a remnant of the original Islamic structure of the cards, as well as a consequence of the rules dictated by a religious Italian governing body that modelled many of the cards after church figures like the Pope. Well, I really don't know where to begin there. Church figures like the Pope. There are really only 2 church figures like the Pope in the tarot pack. One of them is the Pope, and one of them is the female Pope. Both highly subversive symbols, which I shall talk about later. There aren't any other church-like figures. There are no saints. There are some virtues, some of which are always female, some of which are usually female. And then the idea of rules being dictated by a religious Italian governing body. Well, there was, let's face it, only one religious Italian governing body. It was called the Church. The idea of them, dictating that church figures should be inserted into the tarot. The Church was always highly opposed to tarot cards. They thought they were a vicious thing. They thought people should stop playing with tarot cards. Unfortunate but true. Women, psychic women, who used tarot cards for fortune telling or for magic, they would be tried as witches. The Church hated tarot cards, and in fact, in 1725, the Church actually managed to issue a decree forcing the producers of tarot cards to take the Pope and the Popess out of the deck and replace them with Jupiter and Juno. So what is that? There is a lot here that I would question. There's a section on Marie-Anne Lenormand, the famous psychic at the time of Napoleon, and it's clear that the author doesn't know the difference between Lenormand cards and tarot cards. Lenormand cards are not tarot cards, but that's a minor quibble. Another minor quibble, page 120, the author is talking about the printing of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and she says the deck was reprinted multiple times, first in black and white and later as a colour version. Well, I have to say the first edition of the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot is quite well known. It came out in 1909. It's known as the Roses and Lilies deck because it has roses and lilies on the back. It's in full colour and you can get a reprint of it for yourself quite cheaply on Amazon. A minor quibble, but it does say something about the overall accuracy of this book. She says on page 106, as tarot became more popular in the 19th century, and then on page 107, in the 1800s, tarot faded in popularity. I mean, the 1800s are the 19th century, aren't they? So either it became more popular or less popular. But I also want to talk to you about what she says about the actual creation of the Rider-Waite-Smith by Pamela and A.E. Waite. Now, as you probably know, the Rider-Waite-Smith was the project of A.E. Waite, and A.E. Waite employed Pamela to illustrate the cards. She talks about how revolutionary Pamela's minor arcana was, and then she says she also inserted her own voice into the deck, reimagining previously Christian-influenced cards like the Pope and Papess as the Hierophant and the High Priestess. Okay, now ladies and gentlemen, this is not true by any stretch. Have a look at this book. It's by Helen Farley. It's called A Cultural History of the Tarot. And it's probably the most authoritative book on tarot that there is. It's very dry, it's very academic. Every chapter has about 300 footnotes. The idea of changing the name of the Pope to the Hierophant and the Papess to the High Priestess was already over 100 years old when Pamela Colman Smith drew her deck. The first person to have that idea and to write about it was Coeur de Guesbelin, writing in 1781. Now, there was a whole tradition of occultism in Europe, in France and England, in the 18th and the 19th century, of which A.E. Waite was, if you like, the heir. This was not an idea of Pamela Colman Smith's. And Cat Willett comments further on down the page, think about that. It's one thing to produce such an abundance of drawings in a short period of time with straightforward instruction, but quite another entirely to innovate and dream up new characters and symbolic meanings under rather questionable guidance. Well, I think that's quite a cheap dig at A.E. Waite to call him questionable guidance. A.E. Waite spent his lifetime in libraries and museums. He must have been, one of the great experts in tarot, either in England or America at the time. And Pamela did innovate to some extent. Her minor arcana was inspired by the Sola Busca deck. She was brilliant, she was psychic, she did put a lot of new stuff in, and let's acknowledge that. But we don't have to start denying that the Rider-Waite-Smith deck was a collaboration between A.E. Waite and Pamela Colman Smith. That's nonsense. They were a great team as far as creating a tarot deck was concerned. And frankly, the attack on A.E. Waite gets worse in this book. And I think at the heart of the book, there is this intention to actually discredit Waite and to create the myth that this tarot is more or less entirely the creation of Pamela Colman Smith. I also find it interesting that Cat Willett insists all through this book on referring to the Rider-Waite deck, okay, because it's so outrageous that Pamela's name doesn't appear on the deck. Actually, no tarotist refers to it as the Rider-Waite deck anymore. We refer to it as the RWS, the Rider-Waite-Smith. And, you know, the more recent editions of the Rider-Waite-Smith have been called the Waite-Smith deck, which is probably its best name. The fact that US Games Systems is still cranking out the old version in its old box, which ignores Pamela, is a pity. But, you know, take that up with US Game Systems, write to them. The world has moved on. And I think, this is disingenuous, I think the author here is deliberately calling it the Rider-Waite deck to make us all cross. So there's more stuff in this book about what a terrible person A.E. Waite was. Cat Willett says Arthur essentially claimed conceptual credit for Pamela's work. Well, let's talk about conceptual credit. It is certainly highly controversial and highly unfortunate that Pamela's name did not appear on the pack. Nevertheless, how do tarot packs get made? How do they still get made to this very day? A producer comes along with an idea for a tarot pack, usually, and hires an illustrator. Most illustrators are not tarot experts, so the producer will feed, or as it says in this book, spoon feed the illustrator ideas, concepts and structures for the deck. A.E. Waite was lucky to meet Pamela because she was interested in the Golden Dawn. She was a member of the Golden Dawn and she was a fantastic, fabulous psychic person. So, as I say, great partnership. Okay, so let's briefly touch on the story, the terrible story of Pamela not getting royalties. It says here in this book, Arthur also ensured that Pamela did not receive any publishing royalties, a practice that has been in place since the Middle Ages, whatever that means. Pamela Colman Smith was an upper middle class woman with powerful friends. She was an adult. She could have held out for a royalties contract. It wasn't the Middle Ages, it was 1909. She goes on, this meant that she was not compensated beyond the initial meagre payment she received for the project, regardless of how many decks were ultimately sold. Had the situation been different, with Arthur willing to share in the royalties and success of the deck, Pamela almost certainly would have had a stabler financial future. Well, almost certainly. The Rider-Waite-Smith deck didn't sell in any great quantities during Pamela's lifetime. It was only after she died, unfortunately, that it became a big hit. So yeah, I think this book is disingenuous in many ways. It feels rushed, it feels under-researched, but more than anything, it feels like a kind of exploitation of Pamela's memory in the service of presenting a stirring story. It feels a bit like a movie that sort of strays from the historical facts in order to get our emotions pumping. I think people who care about tarot and people who care about the memory of Pamela Colman Smith would like Pamela to be better known than she is, and would like to correct the injustice of her name not appearing on the deck for so many years. But I think we would like that to happen within a more fact-based and measured way. You have been watching Robert Farrar's Tea and Tarot. I'll be back next week. Bye for now.